The sun was still rising behind the Carolina pines when I pulled up the gravel driveway, dead tired from a 2-day fishing trip and smelling like catfish guts and stubbornness. I was ready for nothing more than a shower, a slice of peach pie, and maybe a quick nap in the hammock I'd strung between my old pecan trees. But as I rounded the corner of the house and looked out over my backyard, I damn near dropped the bait cooler. My garden was gone. In its place stood a full-blown wedding altar draped in white silk and plastic roses, surrounded by rows and rows of white folding chairs. A string quartet was tuning their instruments under a pop-up tent, and someone had installed a champagne bar where my tomato beds used to be. I stood there stunned, mouth half open like a broken mailbox. Either I died out on that lake, I muttered, or someone's getting married on my beans. Just then, a young woman in heels and a matching lavender dress jogged past me, clutching a clipboard and yelling something about the flower arrangements being 10 minutes late. She didn't even glance in my direction. A few of my neighbors waved at me from their chairs like I was the groundskeeper. One of them, Mark from 2 houses down, actually asked if I could grab him a lemonade. I was too baffled to answer. That's when she came strutting out from behind the altar like the Queen of England herself. Eleanor Vance, president of the HOA, owner of a smile as fake as her eyelashes, and the kind of woman who talked like every sentence should be framed and hung in a rulebook. She had a rhinestone visor on her head, a walkie-talkie clipped to her belt, and that deadly little clipboard clutched in her French manicured claws. "Oh, Sam," she chirped, swanning over like this was all perfectly normal. "You're back early. We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." I stared at her. "Eleanor, why is there a wedding in my yard?" She blinked like I'd asked her to explain gravity. "It's Emily's big day, my daughter, remember? We needed a venue with rustic charm and soft southern light. Your backyard has the perfect exposure. It also has my shed, my sprinkler system, and my damn garden," I retorted. She waved that off like I was talking about squirrels. "Relax, we didn't touch the weird herbs. We just needed the space for ambience. The photographer said the golden hour hits your oak tree perfectly. You'll thank us when you see how it turns out. Just stay out of frame." I don't remember walking away, but somehow I ended up on my porch, bourbon in hand and rage climbing up my spine like ivy on a brick wall. My whole backyard, my land, had been hijacked like it was a public park. No warning, no request, just a full invasion complete with caterers, florists, and a 12-piece wedding band now arriving with amps. I called the sheriff. They said it was a civil matter. I called the county assessor. They said the property had been incorporated into the HOA jurisdiction 10 years ago, and any dispute would have to go through the HOA board. I called the board, straight to voicemail. Eleanor had played a game, and I was the poor sap who didn't realize I'd been drafted. Apparently, there was some obscure clause in the HOA charter about shared communal space usage under special community events, and she had twisted it into justifying the complete takeover of my land. Easement privilege, she called it. I called it trespassing with extra audacity. That night, as the rehearsal dinner buzzed with flute glasses and fake laughter, I sat on the porch and watched my property become a backdrop for people who wouldn't even make eye contact with me. One of the guests asked if I was the gardener. Another one handed me their keys and asked if I could move their BMW up the driveway. Eleanor just smiled and told everyone I was the local character. I smiled back and nodded because sometimes, when people mistake silence for weakness, they forget what a quiet man can do when he's mad. Around 10 p.m., when the noise finally died down and Eleanor's army of wedding planners marched back to their rental cars, I walked down to the edge of my yard and looked at the space where my tomato plants had once thrived. I thought of my wife, God rest her, and how she used to string lights through those same trees for our anniversary dinners, how she loved this land, wild edges and all, how she always told me, "When people cross your lines, don't shout. Just build a better fence or invite bigger friends." I lit a cigar and took one long draw. The next morning, I put on my boots, grabbed my phone, and drove 15 minutes down Highway 9 to a place called the Rusty Sprocket. It wasn't much to look at, just a bar and grill with patched-up siding and a chain-link fence around a dusty lot full of motorcycles. But inside, that's where the real all-Americans live. These were my people, bikers, veterans, misfits, gearheads, and good folks with no patience for pretentious HOA nonsense. The kind of folks who respected property lines and raised hell when they were crossed. I pushed open the door, nodded to the bartender, and raised my voice just enough. "I've got a backyard," I said, "and someone's hosting a wedding on it tomorrow without my permission. Anyone want to help me decorate? Every head in that bar turned toward me, and then slowly, one of them grinned. A woman with a mohawk and a vest full of patches leaned forward and said, "You want loud, funny, or unforgettable?" I smiled. "Why not all three?" They laughed. Someone banged a beer bottle on the counter. Another guy, Tiny they called him, though he looked like he could lift a Harley, stood up and said, "You just tell us when to show up. We'll bring the party favors." As I walked out of the Rusty Sprocket, the sun hit just right through the trees again. Golden hour, as Eleanor had called it. She was right about one thing. My backyard did make a beautiful venue. But if she thought her daughter's wedding was going to be picture perfect, she hadn't counted on the Harley choir, and I had every intention of making her regret it. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, like the weather itself wanted a front row seat to the chaos about to unfold. Birds chirped innocently in the trees lining Mitchell Acres, entirely unaware that their peaceful morning was about to be accompanied by the guttural rumble of V-twin engines. I stood on my porch sipping coffee, watching as the white tents were erected again in my backyard. Eleanor's army of vendors returned in full force: hairdressers, photographers, floral decorators, and a caterer whose van had the nerve to park halfway into my garden without so much as a knock. My fence line meant nothing to these people. To them, my yard was just a rustic canvas, and I was the old man they planned to edit out of the wedding photos. I didn't say a word as they scrambled around, adjusting flower placements and barking orders into walkie-talkies. I didn't need to. The gears of my plan were already turning. Down the road, a dozen motorcycles were being polished, patched denim vests shaken out, and boots stomped clean of yesterday's dust. I had given the bikers a simple message: arrive at 2 o'clock sharp, dress like yourselves, and bring the noise. Eleanor, meanwhile, was in peak form, circling like a hawk, clipboard flapping in hand, headset firmly strapped to her head, as if she were directing a military operation rather than her daughter's wedding. I watched her stop the violinist mid-note to adjust the angle of the sheet music stand. She corrected the flower girl's walk 3 times. When she saw me, she smiled that tight-lipped Karen smile and called out, "Sam, we moved a few things around, but don't worry, we left your little shed untouched. If you could stay inside during the ceremony, that'd be fantastic." I raised my mug. "Won't be a problem. Wouldn't want to ruin your aesthetic." She gave a thumbs up like she'd just resolved international diplomacy and then disappeared back into the crowd. I waited until she was out of sight and then got to work. I went around to the back of the shed and connected my outdoor speakers, the ones I usually reserve for playing old Johnny Cash records while mowing the lawn. But today, Johnny was getting a break. Today, my speakers were queued up to something special: screaming goats. Dozens of sound clips, all of them screeching in various keys and pitches. Just a little ambience to warm them up before the real guests arrived. By early afternoon, guests in pastel suits and floral dresses began to flood into the yard, sipping champagne and pretending not to notice the faint stench of freshly tilled earth underneath their dress shoes. They posed for pictures in front of my oak tree, completely ignoring the private property sign that had clearly been moved behind a potted hydrangea. I smiled and kept playing the polite fool. Every now and then, I'd wave, and they'd wave back like I was part of the landscaping. At exactly 2 o'clock, a sound rumbled in the distance, low rolling thunder that grew louder by the second. Glasses of champagne trembled. Eleanor looked up from her checklist, brow furrowed. Then the first motorcycle rounded the corner, followed by another, then a dozen more. They came in staggered formation, engines roaring like a beast had woken up in the woods. Men and women in black leather, chains, sunglasses, tattoos. One guy wore a Viking helmet. Another had a pet parrot on his shoulder. A woman in a born-to-be-mild shirt rode side saddle, sipping iced tea like she was on her front porch. The guests froze. Someone gasped. Eleanor dropped her clipboard. The motorcycles lined up along the edge of my property, tires crunching softly against the gravel. Not a single one crossed into the official wedding zone. They were perfectly legal, perfectly loud. I stepped down from my porch and walked up to their leader, Big Mike, a mountain of a man who once arm wrestled a bear for charity and had the scars to prove it. He grinned and handed me a speaker. "Mike, you ready to start the show, Sam?" "Oh, I was born ready," I said. I flipped the switch on my remote, and every speaker in the yard burst to life, not with music, but with synchronized goat screams. The sudden chorus of bleeding chaos startled everyone. The flower girl dropped her basket. The violinist threw his bow. Eleanor clutched her chest like she'd been shot with a tranquilizer dart. People started murmuring, spinning around in confusion. Then, over the goat symphony, came a second wave, the biker choir. 20 voices belting out the most metal rendition of Here Comes the Bride that had ever been heard this side of Nashville. Electric guitars blasted from hidden amps I'd stashed behind my shed. Drums pounded like thunder, and a bald man with a ZZ-Top beard screamed a solo that made 2 pigeons fall out of a tree. Eleanor sprinted toward me, heels stabbing divots into my lawn, veil flapping behind her like a panicked ghost. "What are you doing?" "This is a private wedding." I shrugged. "Not according to your easement clause. Just enjoying the shared aesthetic ambience." She was turning red now, sputtering something about noise ordinances and emergency citations. "You are violating the sanctity of this event." "Oh, you mean like when someone hijacks a man's yard without permission and installs a mimosa bar next to his compost heap?" Her mouth opened, then closed. She turned to the sheriff, who had arrived due to a noise complaint, but after seeing the setup, merely tipped his hat at me and leaned against his cruiser with a grin. I stepped aside to let a group of bikers through. One had a tray of hot dogs, handing them out to guests who looked torn between horror and hunger. Kids were laughing. Teens were recording everything on their phones. Eleanor's son-in-law tried to stop the guitarist, but the man just nodded politely and turned the amp to 11. The climax came when one of the bikers, Donna, a former opera singer turned mechanic, stood at the front and belted out a high C that shattered a champagne flute and brought the entire yard to a stunned silence. Even the goats stopped. Then the applause started, from the back, a slow, ironic clap from one of the guests, then another, and then laughter. Because once the absurdity hit full saturation, people couldn't help but embrace it. They took selfies with the bikers. The flower girl high-fived a tattooed giant. Even the wedding photographer gave up and started taking action shots of the chaos. Eleanor disappeared into her rented tent, screaming into her walkie-talkie like a general losing a war she thought she'd already won. But the wedding rolled on. Her daughter didn't even seem upset. If anything, she looked relieved to have something real happening at her carefully scripted event. As the sun began to dip, I stood by my pecan tree, arms folded, heart thumping with satisfaction. The yard was a mess, but it was my mess. No one was ignoring me anymore. No one was pretending I didn't exist. And best of all, this circus was just getting started. The official ceremony was scheduled for 3 o'clock sharp. Eleanor had printed the programs herself. Thick cardstock with gold foil lettering and floral borders reading, "The Vance Tillman Union, a celebration of elegance." She'd even included a little blurb on the back about the tranquil southern setting curated by the Homeowners Association. I found one stuffed under a bush by the shed and used it to level the leg on my rocking chair. By now, the guests had either adjusted to the absurdity or given up trying to fight it. Some had even started enjoying themselves. The bikers had taken over my driveway and were grilling ribs on a portable smoker, offering cold sweet tea, and playing lawn darts with old spark plugs. The kids were in heaven. The parents pretended to be horrified, but I caught more than a few sneaking extra ribs and laughing behind their hands. As the hour approached, Eleanor emerged from the bridal tent like a storm cloud wrapped in chiffon. Her eyes locked on me as she marched across the lawn in heels sharp enough to aerate the soil. Behind her, her daughter Emily, the actual bride, trailed nervously in a gown that looked more like a prom dress than a wedding outfit, holding onto a bouquet the size of a watermelon. The string quartet, now visibly traumatized by earlier events, attempted to gather their courage and resume their positions. Eleanor stopped just short of my property line and hissed, "Sam, I am issuing a formal cease and desist." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, going to file it with the ribs or the goat choir? This is harassment. You are intentionally disrupting a legally sanctioned event." "No, ma'am," I said, calm as a breeze. "I'm just having a peaceful gathering on my own land. You said we were sharing ambience. I thought we were collaborating." She glared, her nostrils flaring like a startled mule. "You will regret this. You're going to be fined into the ground." I took a sip of lemonade and gave her the kind of smile that made men nervous back in my Navy days. "Eleanor, if I had $1 for every time someone underestimated me, I could have bought this entire subdivision and turned it into a goat rescue sanctuary." Just then, a dozen more motorcycles pulled in, parking with precision on the side yard. The riders dismounted with practiced ease, as if arriving for church. One of them, a guy named Diesel, unfolded a collapsible drum kit, and began warming up. Another handed out fake mustaches to the flower girls. I looked over at the guests, most of whom had now abandoned their chairs to watch the spectacle unfold. Laughter floated through the air. Someone shouted, "This is better than Netflix." The ceremony was supposed to start, but Eleanor was too busy barking into her phone, trying to get the HOA board on an emergency Zoom call. Her husband, a meek man named Dennis with the personality of a damp sponge, stood at the altar holding a clipboard and looking like he wished he could dissolve into the grass. Emily, the bride, looked increasingly uncertain as the crowd split its attention between her and the guy juggling beer cans next to the grill. Then the unexpected happened. She walked up to me. She was quiet at first, just standing next to my chair, bouquet trembling in her hands. I looked up, ready for a fight or a plea, but instead she said, "Mr. Carter, can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Shoot. Is it true you built that tree swing yourself? The one the little kids are playing on?" "Yep. About 30 years ago. Used to push my boy on it every Sunday before church." She looked down at the grass. "I didn't want any of this. The tents, the photographers, the matching seat covers. I just wanted to get married and not feel like a show pony." I tilted my head. "Then why let your mama run the circus?" She sighed. "Because she's been planning this since I was 10, and she always gets what she wants. Only if people let her." There was a long silence between us. Then she smiled, small and real. "You're kind of a legend in this neighborhood." I chuckled. "Well, legends usually come with a warning label." Without another word, she turned back toward the crowd, ripped off her veil, and tossed the bouquet over her shoulder. It landed on the grill with a sizzle. The bikers erupted in cheers. Eleanor screamed something about contamination and collapsed into a lawn chair. Emily walked up to her groom, took his hand, and said, "Let's get married under the pecan tree. The swing makes a better backdrop anyway." And that's exactly what they did. They moved the entire ceremony 15 feet over, into my yard, officially outside the bounds of Eleanor's precious HOA jurisdiction. The officiant, one of the bikers dressed in full Elvis gear for reasons I never questioned, performed the ceremony with sincerity and just the right amount of flair. The bride and groom said their vows with bare feet in the dirt and smiles on their faces. The guests cheered, the goats bleated, and even the string quartet joined in by improvising a bluegrass version of the wedding march. Eleanor didn't speak. She just sat there, hands clenched in her lap, lips pursed so tight they looked like they'd been vacuum sealed. Dennis tried to offer her a napkin. She slapped it away. After the ceremony, the party rolled on. The bikers set up tables with food and drinks. Music played from my porch, and neighbors I hadn't seen in months wandered over to shake my hand and say things like, "You really showed her," and "You should run for HOA president." I laughed and deflected. I wasn't interested in titles. I just wanted to be left alone with my land, my memories, and the occasional barbecue. As dusk settled in and the lights twinkled through the oak branches, one of the biker ladies came up to me. She was in her 60s, with silver braids and a leather jacket covered in patches from places I'd only heard about. She handed me a cold beer and sat on the steps beside me. "You did something good today," she said. "I mostly just made noise." "No," she said, looking out at the dancing crowd. "You gave people permission to live, even if just for a day." I didn't say anything. I just watched the bride laughing barefoot in my grass and felt something shift in my chest. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a stubborn old man fighting a losing battle. I felt like someone who'd carved out a little island of freedom in a world gone plastic, and that was worth every goat scream. The sun dipped low behind the pine trees as the wedding crowd began to thin, though the laughter and clinking glasses still echoed through the yard. Kids ran barefoot through the grass. Wedding guests shared ribs with bikers, and somewhere near my old shed, two women, one in pearls, one in leather, were dancing like they just remembered how. But peace, I knew, was temporary. Eleanor wasn't finished. She never was. Somewhere behind that frozen smile and helmet of hairspray was a woman plotting the mother of all comebacks. And it didn't take long before her wheels started turning again. Around 7, just as Big Mike began telling the story of how he once outran a tornado on a Harley, a white SUV with the HOA logo stenciled on the door pulled up to the curb like a declaration of war. Out stepped Martin Cole, the HOA board's so-called compliance officer, wearing a tie too tight for the heat and a clipboard like it was a badge of honor. He walked up the driveway, adjusting his glasses, clearly trying to look like authority personified, but coming off more like a lost accountant at a county fair. He cleared his throat and called out, "Mr. Carter." I nodded from my porch chair, beer in hand, surrounded by 3 dogs, 2 bikers, and a karaoke machine someone had dragged out of a sidecar. Martin glanced nervously around before taking a deep breath and reading from his clipboard. "This is an official notice from the Pine Valley Homeowners Association. You are in violation of Section 14, Article B, unauthorized gatherings without board approval. You are hereby fined $5,000 for noncompliance and disruption of neighborhood standards." I raised my eyebrows, leaned forward, and said, $5,000? You want me to write that on a goat? Or you prefer a pig? Martin blinked. "Excuse me." Before I could answer, Eleanor stormed up beside him, back in full battle mode. Her hair looked like it had been re-sprayed into submission, and her blouse bore a fresh stain from someone's spilled sangria. She was seething. "This is not funny, Sam. You humiliated me. You humiliated my daughter. And you're going to pay for it." I stood up slowly, stretched my back, and walked down the steps until I was standing right in front of her. The crowd around us quieted. Even the goats seemed to hold their breath. "I didn't humiliate anyone, Eleanor," I said. "You did that all by yourself. You came into my yard without permission. You staged a wedding on land you don't own. You used my tree, my garden, my space, and you didn't even ask. All I did was invite a few friends to enjoy the view." She scoffed. "Don't pretend this was innocent. You planned this. You orchestrated a hostile takeover of my event." I looked around at the kids roasting marshmallows on a motorcycle tailpipe, the bride twirling barefoot in the grass, the retirees in lawn chairs swapping biker stories with grizzled men who hadn't worn sleeves since the Reagan era. "Looks to me like folks are just having a good time." Martin, clearly uncomfortable, tried to interject. "Mr. Carter, regardless of intent, the board has determined that your gathering qualifies as a violation, and under the HOA charter, we're authorized to issue fines and initiate lien proceedings if..." I cut him off. "You sure about that?" He stuttered. "Well, yes, the language is very clear." I turned, walked into the house, and came back with a file folder. I handed it to him. "That's my deed. Go ahead and read the date." He flipped it open, brows furrowing. 1973? "That's right," I said. "This land was deeded to me by my grandfather long before the Pine Valley HOA ever existed. The line stops right there at the drainage ditch. You and your charter don't have jurisdiction over 1 inch of this property. I'm not in the HOA, never have been. I just never bothered to correct you people because I figured, hell, live and let live. But you pushed your luck." Eleanor's face turned the color of a beet left out in the sun. "That can't be. That land was annexed. It was voted on. Voted on by people who don't own it," I said calmly. "And the county records agree with me." I checked twice. Martin went pale. He adjusted his glasses again, cleared his throat, and mumbled something about needing to verify with legal. He retreated so fast I thought he might trip over his clipboard. The crowd erupted in cheers. Someone popped another beer. The DJ, emboldened, queued up a version of "We're Not Gonna Take It" and cranked the volume. Eleanor didn't move. She just stood there, fists clenched, eyes darting back and forth like she was searching for a way to rewind the whole day. But there wasn't one. Her daughter was already slow dancing in the moonlight. Her son-in-law had taken off his tie and was playing horseshoes with a man named Chainsaw Rick, and her precious HOA authority had just dissolved like cotton candy in the rain. She finally turned, stormed off toward her car, and slammed the door hard enough to make the streetlight flicker. As she peeled away down the street, I noticed she had parked across 3 driveways. Typical. With Eleanor gone and the HOA defanged, the rest of the neighborhood let out a collective exhale. The stiff upper lips relaxed. The whispered judgments evaporated. People started talking, really talking. Old grudges thawed. Someone brought over a pie. Mark from down the block, who hadn't said more than 10 words to me in 5 years, leaned over and said, "Sam, that was the most fun I've had since my kids moved out." I smiled and clinked bottles with him. "You should come by more often. Maybe next time we have a goat rodeo." He laughed. "If you're hosting, I'm in." Later that night, when the embers of the grill glowed low and the last of the wedding guests finally wandered home, I sat back on the porch with Big Mike and Diesel, watching the stars blink overhead. For the first time in a long time, the yard felt like mine again, not just by law, but in spirit. It was alive. It had meaning again. Big Mike took a sip of whiskey and said, "You ever think about running for something? HOA president, mayor, local deity?" I shook my head. I don't need a title. Just need a yard I can call my own. Diesel chuckled. Well, you've definitely earned that. And I got to say, you throw one hell of a party. I looked out over the grass, still trampled and sparkling with the last bits of glitter from Eleanor's doomed centerpieces. Wasn't supposed to be a party, I said. Just supposed to be a reminder. I leaned back in my chair and watched a goat climb onto the swing and gently rock back and forth. A reminder that some things can't be stolen, not without consequences. By the time the sun rose the next morning, there wasn't much left of the chaos, at least not on the surface. The tents were gone, the chairs had vanished, and the string quartet had made their quiet retreat sometime after midnight, possibly still humming the outlaw version of Here Comes the Bride. What remained was a yard full of footprints, a few beer bottles tucked behind flower beds, and a lingering sense that something extraordinary had happened here. My pecan tree stood tall as ever, its swing gently swaying in the breeze as if nodding at the memory of a wedding that was never meant to happen this way, and yet somehow turned out exactly right. I stepped out onto the porch with my coffee and looked around. The place smelled like charcoal and wildflowers, and the grass was just starting to forgive the abuse it had endured. Out by the shed, a couple of the biker folks were still sleeping under a makeshift tarp, snoring like bears in winter. One of the goats, Freckles, the small spotted one, had found her way onto the porch and was chewing the corner of a paper plate like it owed her money. I nudged her with my boot. You partied harder than half the guests, I said. She blinked at me, unbothered. The cleanup didn't bother me. After years of maintaining this land, I'd seen worse. Storms, wild pigs, even that one time a drone dropped a box of meatballs into my garden during a 4th of July mishap. What mattered wasn't the mess. It was the change. The neighborhood had shifted, quietly but clearly. The lines that had been drawn in stone by the HOA and their rigid little rules now looked more like suggestions. It wasn't just me who'd stood up to Eleanor. It was all of us. The quiet neighbors, the fence-sitters, the ones who always smiled politely but kept their heads down. Last night, we all remembered that we had voices and, more importantly, choices. Just before noon, a group of neighbors started showing up, uninvited, unannounced, but welcome all the same. Mark brought coffee and donuts. Sandra, who hadn't spoken to me since I built a scarecrow she called grotesquely aggressive, showed up with a broom and a casserole. Even old man Whitaker, who once tried to fine me for leaving my hose uncoiled, came limping across the lawn with a trash bag and a sheepish grin. We didn't say much at first. We just started cleaning. Quiet, steady, neighborly work. No meetings, no minutes. Just hands in the dirt, laughter in the air, and a shared understanding that maybe the rules hadn't been working for any of us. By mid-afternoon, the yard looked better than it had in months. Someone had replanted the flower bed. Someone else patched a broken piece of fence I'd been meaning to fix. And right there under the pecan tree, where Eleanor's altar had once stood like a monument to vanity, I dug a small hole and planted a young maple sapling. I didn't make a speech or call anyone over, just knelt down, packed the dirt, and set a little garden gnome beside it, the same one my wife had painted years ago, with chipped eyes and a crooked smile. For a moment, the noise of everything else faded away, and I just sat there, hand on the soil, feeling the roots settle into place. Then came the unexpected. I was still brushing dirt from my jeans when a loud rumble rolled up the road again. Another motorcycle, but not one I recognized. It pulled into the driveway, a lean silver machine with saddlebags and chrome so polished you could see your regrets in it. The rider took off her helmet, and I blinked in surprise. It was Donna, the silver-braided biker from the night before, the one who'd sung that operatic high note that shattered Eleanor's final shred of dignity. She grinned and walked up to me, holding a small envelope. You busy next weekend? Depends, I said, taking it. Am I fixing a carburetor or breaking up another HOA wedding? Neither, she said. You're officiating mine. I laughed, thinking she was joking, but her eyes said otherwise. I'm serious, she said. Me and Tess have been talking about tying the knot for years. Figured if anyone knows how to host a wedding with soul, it's you. And your yard has better vibes than any chapel we've seen. I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten invitation that simply said, love, leather, and lemonade. Saturday at 5 o'clock. Dress code, you. For the first time in years, I felt something stir in my chest. Not just pride, not just rebellion, but connection, purpose. I looked at the tree we just planted, then back at her. I'd be honored, I said. As she rode off, kicking up dust and waving like a queen on a parade float, I turned back to the yard. This patch of stubborn land, this thorn in Eleanor's side, had become something bigger than me. It had become a gathering place, a rebellion headquarters, a sanctuary for those who still believed in being neighborly without needing a regulation to do it. And if that meant a few more goats, a few more barbecue stains, and the occasional wedding under the pecan tree, then so be it. Later that evening, just as I was putting away the last of the folding chairs someone had returned from who knows where, a letter arrived. No envelope, just a single folded page taped to my door. It was from Eleanor. The handwriting was tight and formal, like someone writing a resignation letter with a ruler under their hand. It read, "Mr. Carter, effective immediately, I am resigning from my position as president of the Pine Valley Homeowners Association due to personal stress and irreconcilable differences within the community. I believe it is in the best interest of the neighborhood that I step down. I will be taking time to focus on self-care and reflection. Sincerely, Eleanor Vance." There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just an exit. And yet, it felt like the sweetest note I'd ever received. I folded it carefully and stuck it on the fridge, right next to a picture of my wife holding a tomato the size of her head. She always said I had a talent for growing things. That night, I sat on the porch again, rocking slowly as fireflies danced through the air. The goats were asleep in the shed. The swing creaked gently. The stars were brighter than usual, or maybe I just noticed them more. And for the first time in a long time, the world didn't feel quite so heavy. I didn't win anything, really. I didn't take a title or claim a crown. All I did was hold my ground. But sometimes, that's all it takes to remind people where the line is and what happens when someone like Eleanor crosses it. Somewhere in the distance, a bike engine purred. Another guest, maybe? Another story waiting to happen? I raised my glass to the darkness and smiled. This yard wasn't just mine anymore.